August 1945. The war was over, but for the men of the USS Ember, survival was not guaranteed. Lost in the Pacific, their ship was crippled, their compass broken. They were drifting blind toward a minefield. In the brig, a Japanese captain named Shoji Hatanaka sat calmly awaiting his execution. He had been taught that Americans were savages. They had been told that he was a fanatic. But with death just hours away, the American commander did the unthinkable. He walked his prisoner to the bridge and handed him the wheel. They gave control of their ship to the one man who had every reason to watch them die. But before we continue this incredible true story, if you believe in the power of humanity to overcome hate, make sure you hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what part of the world you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. In the hushed, climate-controlled quiet of the Naval Museum, Emi Hatanaka Reyes gently placed an old, tattered notebook into its final resting place. A glass display case bathed in soft light. Its cover was stained with salt and time, the pages swollen and stiff. Beside her, a curator leaned in, his voice a low hum that filled the reverent space as he read the small plaque aloud. Belonged to Captain Shoji Hatanaka, Imperial Japanese Navy, 1945. Found aboard the USS Ember, week of surrender. The words hung in the air, a simple epitaph for a story that had almost been lost to the sea. Emi rested her hand on the glass for a moment, a silent connection to the man she had never known, whose ghost lived inside that fragile script. The story began in a place of violent noise, not museum silence. It began on a night when the Pacific was a furious, black beast, heaving and clawing at the hull of the USS Ember. The ship was a wounded animal, limping through hostile waters, after a skirmish left it scarred, and a storm had finished the job. The radio was dead, the food was nearly gone, and the morale of the young crew had sunk lower than the battered keel. They were adrift, a ghost ship on an enemy ocean. It was on that night that a lookout spotted it, a single lifeboat rising and falling on the violent swells, carrying 3 figures. They were Japanese sailors, survivors from a patrol boat the Ember had sunk days before. As they were brought aboard, soaked and shivering, the Americans tensed, their hands hovering over their weapons. They had been trained to expect a final, desperate act of defiance, a hidden grenade, a last cry of banzai before a suicidal charge. One of the men, his face a mask of exhausted dignity, wore the insignia of a captain. This was Shoji Hatanaka. But there was no fight in his eyes. He met the gaze of the American commander, offered no resistance, and surrendered with a quiet, unnerving calm that unsettled the crew more than any threat could have. Below deck, the air was thick with sweat, fear, and resentment. Lieutenant Commander Walter Gaines stood before a gathering of his senior men, a small, worn copy of the Geneva Convention held open in his hand. His voice was steady, a rock in the churning sea of their anxiety. He read the rules of engagement, the paragraphs on the treatment of prisoners of war, reminding them that the laws of decency did not end just because the world outside had gone mad. "We will follow the code," he finished, his eyes scanning each man's face. "They are prisoners, not animals." Beside him, the ship's corpsman, a kind-faced boy from Indiana named Red Delaney, nodded in agreement. But others shifted their feet, their expressions hard and unforgiving. The whispers started, quiet and venomous. They spoke of Okinawa, of friends lost to brutal ambushes and comrades who had taken their own lives rather than be captured. These Japanese didn't deserve kindness, they muttered. They deserved what they gave. Confined to the damp chill of the brig, Captain Shoji Hatanaka sat perfectly still on a narrow cot. He neither ate nor drank what was offered. In the rigid discipline of his posture was a lifetime of training, but beneath it, his spirit was in turmoil. He was a dead man already, He knew this. His execution was only a matter of time. In his mind, he saw the faces of his own crew, young men who had followed him into the sea. One by one, they had chosen the honor of death, their duty fulfilled. He alone had failed. He had survived. And for that, he felt a shame so profound it was a physical weight, crushing the air from his lungs. He was not only a prisoner of the Americans, he was a prisoner of his own life, a ghost haunted by the honorable dead. Then the storm returned, a final, furious assault. It threw the Ember back and forth like a toy, the groan of twisting metal echoing through the ship. A rogue wave crashed over the bridge, shattering glass and flooding the navigation station. When the water receded, Walt Gaines saw the ruin. The charts were a pulpy, useless mush. The delicate mechanisms of the primary compass were jammed, its needle spinning uselessly. They were completely, utterly blind, and they were drifting. Drifting, Walt knew from the old, waterlogged maps in his memory, straight toward a dense minefield laid by the Japanese weeks earlier. They were sailing toward their own extinction, and not a soul on board knew how to stop it. In the suffocating grip of desperation, an impossible idea took root in Walt's mind. There was only one man aboard who knew these currents, who had sailed these waters not as an invader, but as a protector of his own shores. The walk from the brig to the bridge was the longest of Walt's life. He led the Japanese captain through the narrow corridors, the eyes of his crew following them with a mixture of disbelief and fury. Shoji's face remained impassive, but his gaze took in everything, the fear in the sailors' eyes, the wounded list of the ship. On the bridge, Walt gestured toward the helm. He didn't have the words to explain the gamble he was about to take, not in a language they both shared. He could only point to the useless compass, the ruined charts, and then to the dark, churning water ahead. The crew stared, frozen. They expected betrayal. They expected the Japanese captain to seize this one, perfect opportunity for revenge, and steer them all into a fiery death. Shoji, for his part, expected this to be a trick, a cruel prelude to his execution. He looked at the American commander, then at the wheel. For a long moment, the only sound was the howling wind and the groaning ship. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion that carried the weight of two nations, Captain Shoji Hatanaka gave a single, sharp nod. He stepped forward, placed his hands upon the wheel, and began to steer. Under the faint, distant light of the stars, Shoji Hatanaka steered the American ship through a treacherous maze of his own memory. He did not need the broken compass. He read the language of the ocean itself, the pull of the unseen currents, the scent of the wind, the subtle shift in the waves that spoke of hidden dangers below. He was a silent, focused presence on the bridge, his hands steady on the wheel, his expression unreadable. The American crew watched him, their suspicion a tangible thing, a heavy cloak in the humid night air. They stood in two worlds, one where this man was the enemy, a creature of propaganda, and this new, terrifying reality where he was their only hope. The corpsman, Red Delaney, moved first. He approached the helm with a tin cup of water, holding it out not to a prisoner, but to a man doing a hard night's work. Shoji paused, his eyes briefly meeting Red's before he accepted the cup with a slight bow of his head. It was a simple, silent exchange, but in it, a fragile truce was born. As Shoji looked up at the familiar patterns of the night sky, the stars he had known since childhood, he was no longer on an enemy vessel. He was back on a small fishing boat in a calm bay, his young son beside him, his small hand resting on his father's as he pointed to the constellations and whispered their ancient names. The dawn brought with it a cold, gray light and frayed nerves. The tension finally snapped when a young gunner named Jack Evans, his face pale with exhaustion and fury, stepped forward. His friend had died at Okinawa, and the sight of a Japanese officer commanding their bridge was a violation he could no longer stomach. He accused Shoji of deception, his voice cracking with rage, claiming the captain was leading them in circles, waiting for a chance to sabotage them. Before Walt Gaines could intervene, Red Delaney stepped between them. "He's getting us through, Jack," the corpsman said, his voice quiet but firm. It was then that Shoji spoke, his first words in English, his voice low and raspy from disuse. "I give you my skill," he said, his gaze fixed on the young, angry sailor. "Not for me, for your young ones." The words fell into a stunned silence. He was not navigating for his own life, which he had already surrendered, but for theirs. By the second day, the sea had calmed, and the Ember sailed into safe, open water. A cheer erupted from the engine room as the radio, miraculously, crackled back to life. The static gave way to a voice announcing that the war was in its final days. An Allied victory was imminent. The crew erupted in celebration, hugging each other, their faces streaked with grime and tears of relief. But Shoji Hatanaka turned away from their joy, his shoulders slumping as he stared out at the western horizon. He whispered a single phrase in Japanese, a lament for his own family, lost to him now forever. Later, he approached Walt Gaines and made a simple request: a piece of paper and a pen. In the quiet solitude of the brig, he began to write a letter to the son he would never see again, pouring onto the page the honor he feared he had lost. Their salvation arrived in the form of another American destroyer, a sleek, powerful ship that appeared on the horizon to escort the wounded Ember home. But as it drew alongside, the mood shifted. An officer on the destroyer's bridge, seeing the Japanese uniform at the helm of a U.S. vessel, bellowed through a megaphone, and the ship's guns began to turn towards them. They were seconds from being fired upon by their own side. Walt Gaines reacted instantly, stepping directly in front of Shoji, shielding him with his own body. "Stand down!" Walt roared back. "He's a prisoner of war. He saved this ship." The message was relayed, the immediate threat averted, but a colder, more implacable danger took its place. An order came through from Fleet Command, clipped and impersonal. It didn't matter what he had done. Regulations were regulations. The prisoner was to be shackled and transferred immediately. Red watched in disbelief as 2 Marines came aboard and placed irons on Captain Hatanaka's wrists, the metal clicking shut around the hands that had just steered them all to safety. A day later, the official word finally came over the wire. Japan had surrendered. The war was over. The relief that washed over the crew was immense, but for Walt Gaines, it was overshadowed by a grim reality. He was informed that Shoji would not be treated as a standard prisoner of war. By navigating an enemy vessel, he had, under a strict interpretation of military law, committed an act of treason against his own nation. He would likely be handed over to a tribunal and face execution. The crew of the Ember was ordered to sign official statements confirming that Shoji's assistance was non-coerced cooperation, a legal phrase that would seal his fate. The men who owed him their lives hesitated, their pens hovering over the paper. Some refused outright. That evening, as the ship moved through the now peaceful waters, Red Delaney was cleaning the corridor outside the brig when he found a folded piece of paper on the floor. It was the letter Shoji had written. Red opened it, and his breath caught in his throat. The final lines read, "I betrayed my oath, but not my son." He folded it carefully, his hands shaking, and walked straight to the captain's quarters. He found Walt staring at the stack of unsigned affidavits. Without a word, Red placed the letter on the desk. Walt read it, his expression hardening with resolve. Red looked his commander in the eye. "Sir," he said, his voice low but clear, "we've got one more rescue to make." The tribunal officer was a man made of ink and paper, his face a precise arrangement of angles, his uniform so crisp It seemed it might cut the humid air. He sat behind a makeshift desk in the officer's mess of the escort ship, a fountain pen poised over a stack of forms. He represented a system built on procedure, a world where the chaotic, bloody truths of war were flattened into neat lines of text. When Walt Gaines entered, the officer did not look up. He gestured to a chair, his voice dry as dust. "Commander Gaines, I have the preliminary report. The prisoner's actions constitute collaboration. A court-martial is unavoidable." Walt didn't sit. Instead, he placed a thick sheaf of papers on the desk, directly on top of the tribunal's official forms. It was a collection of affidavits, signed not by a few hesitant men, but by every single crew member of the USS Ember, from the lowest engine room grunt to the executive officer. Even the gunner, Jack Evans, had signed his name. Each statement told the same story, not in the sterile language of military reports, but with the raw, honest words of men who had been saved. They testified that Captain Hatanaka had acted not as a traitor, but as a navigator. He had upheld his duty to the sea and shown a regard for human life that transcended the enmity of their nations. The final page was Walt's own request, a formal plea for clemency. He had not asked for a pardon, but for recognition of an honorable act. The officer finally looked up, his expression a mixture of irritation and surprise. He read through the first few pages, his thin lips tightening. This was irregular. It complicated the clean narrative of justice. Men's feelings were not evidence. And yet, the weight of the testimony, the unified voice of an entire crew, was a force the system could not easily dismiss. He set the papers down, the silence stretching. In the fragile, uncertain days after the surrender, the last thing the Navy wanted was a contentious trial that might cast its own officers in a questionable light. An awkward precedent was less dangerous than a public spectacle. He picked up his pen, tapped it twice, and made a decision. There would be no court-martial. The prisoner would be repatriated quietly, his name lost in the vast, anonymous shuffle of returning soldiers. He had not been saved by mercy, but by paperwork. On the day of his departure, Shoji Hatanaka was brought to the deck of the Ember one last time. He was no longer in shackles. The American crew lined the rails, not as guards, but as witnesses. They stood in a silence that was deeper and more meaningful than any words. As Shoji faced Walt Gaines, the two commanders looked at one another across the chasm that had once separated their worlds. Walt raised his hand in a slow, formal salute, a gesture of respect from one captain to another. Then, Red Delaney stepped forward. In his outstretched hand, he held a small, brass compass, dented and worn from years of use. "It was my brother's," Red said softly. "He'd want you to have it, to find your way home." Shoji looked at the gift, then at the young man's earnest face. For the first time, the captain's stoic mask wavered, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. He accepted the compass, and then, gathering himself, he bowed low from the waist, a profound, solemn gesture of gratitude. "I was ready to die in shame," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You let me live with honor." Years melted away, decades turning like pages in a history book, until the roar of the sea was replaced once again by the quiet hum of a museum. Emi Hatanaka Reyes finished her interview with a local television crew, the bright lights dimming as she smiled a weary, gentle smile. The story was told. As she stood by the display case, a man approached, his back stooped with age, his walk the slow, careful gait of an old soldier. He wore a veteran's cap, and his eyes were fixed on the tattered notebook behind the glass. "Your grandfather?" he asked, his voice a frail echo of a younger man's. Emi nodded. The man's own eyes misted over. "I was on that ship," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I was just a boy. Your grandfather, He taught us what mercy looks like. He reached out a trembling hand, not quite touching the glass. A pilgrim paying his respects at a sacred place. Emmy's smile was no longer weary. It was full of a light that bridged the years. She reached into her pocket and took out the small brass compass. With the curator's permission, she opened the case and placed it on the velvet cloth, right next to her grandfather's journal. In the final, quiet moments, as the camera panned across the display, a voiceover began to read. It was the voice of an old man reciting the last lines from a letter written long ago, a father's final testament to his son. "You may hear that I helped the enemy," the voice read, filled with a gentle, timeless wisdom. "But know this, I helped men, not flags. One day I pray that is enough." The camera settled on the journal's final page. There, sketched with a navigator's precise hand, was a drawing of a small, wounded ship, the USS Ember, sailing west toward a horizon of stars. And beside it, drawn with the same loving care, was a compass rose, its needle pointing steadily toward home.